So now that we've talked about the outside of the brain, the cerebrum is going to be our seat of conscious thought and conscious reasoning, and that's one of the reasons we took a long time with that. Whereas the diencephalon, brainstem, and cerebellum all have very important, they are very important, but we're not really as well aware of what they do because they're kind of unconscious processing. So the diencephalon is going to be like the middle part of your brain. So if you think about your brain, like here's the brain stem, the diencephalon is this middle part, and then the cerebral cortex kind of goes around the outside. And if you guys have looked at the brain lab, hopefully you kind of labeled, you have the thalamus on the top, and then we've got the hypothalamus kind of in the middle. And so the diencephalon is this area in here. And it's everything that starts with thalamus. So the epithalamus, the thalamus, and the hypothalamus make up the diencephalon. So here we can see the pineal gland here as part of the epithalamus. We're not really going to talk too much about the habenular nucleus, so really just focus on the pineal gland. The thalamus is actually a lot bigger than it looks on here because the thalamus is two big lobes, but they're sort of off midline. On midline, you only have this little narrow interthalamic adhesion, so the thalamus looks smaller on midline, but it's actually a lot bigger on the outside. And so this is kind of the side of the thalamus that you can see. This is the interthalamic adhesion. It's the little kind of connecting area where the two sides of the thalamus are going to meet. And then the hypothalamus is down here. It's right sort of anterior and inferior to the thalamus. And the mammillary body is going to be kind of coming off that hypothalamus over here. And that's another one you'll need to identify for lab. So the epithalamus is the first part to know. And the other thing to mention here is this little purple outline here. This is the outline of where the third ventricle would be, because if you remember looking at it, the third ventricle is an open space inside the brain, and the third ventricle is on midline. So this is a mid-sagittal section of the brain, and so we're kind of cutting into where the third ventricle would be. So we're looking into kind of this opening of where the third ventricle would be, and everything we're identifying is like, this is the thalamus, it's on the other side of the, the third ventricle, and this is the hypothalamus. So the third ventricle is the open space, whereas the thalamus and the hypothalamus are like the actual parts of the brain that we can see through the third ventricle. So the main thing that we'll talk about in the epithalamus is the pineal gland, and we are also going to focus on the pineal gland in the endocrine section. So when you guys get to 169, in chapter 17, we'll talk about endocrine. And so pineal gland is an endocrine gland, so it secretes hormones into the blood, and specifically this one secretes melatonin. And melatonin, you've probably heard of before. You can take melatonin supplements. It's helpful in regulating your day-night cycles or your circadian rhythm. The habenular nuclei, we don't have to identify in lab. We're not going to talk too much about it, but it's going to be important in relaying signals from the limbic system to the midbrain. So the limbic system is kind of the emotional system of the brain, and once we talk about these the structural deep parts of the brain, we'll talk a little bit about the limbic system. And this is going to be involved in visceral and emotional responses to odors. And so things like when you smell, the limbic system is really important with this too. It kind of goes through, smells are often very closely linked with either memories or like instincts. Like if you smell smoke or fire, like it's going to cause your sympathetic nervous system to be ramped up because you think there's danger. So the thalamus is the next part. The thalamus is that big part right here. It's large. It is, there are two oval masses of gray matter on the lateral sides of the third ventricle, and they're connected in the middle by that interthalamic adhesion. And if you looked at the ventricular model, there's a hole in the middle of the third ventricle, and that is where the interthalamic adhesion would be going. And so we could see right here, so this is like, this would be the interthalamic adhesion. It's actually going to be crossing midline. And so it's going to be kind of surrounded by the third ventricle. And that hole in the third ventricle is where the interthalamic adhesion is going. And so it connects the left and the right thalamus. Your thalamus has a lot of thalamic nuclei. Remember, we said a nuclei is going to be a mass of cell bodies within the CNS. So usually they have a common function. So each nuclei, you might have nuclei that are associated with like sneezing or temperature regulation or something. So these cell bodies work together and they have a common function within the CNS. I'm not going to ask you guys to memorize all these thalamic nuclei, but they may come up later where we'll say like this specific thing happens in this nuclei in the thalamus. And so axons from each different nucleus are going to project to a specific region of the cortex. So one of the important things that the thalamus does is it's going to receive all of the senses except smell, so except olfaction, are going to go through the thalamus first. And the thalamus is kind of like a sensory sorting area. It's going to say this signal came from the eyes, so it must be visual, so I'm going to send it to the occipital lobe. This signal came from the ears, so it must be auditory, so I'm going to send it to the temporal lobe. This signal came from, the skin, so it must be touch. I'm going to send it to the parietal lobe. And so the other thing it does is it kind of filters out other signals that are distracting from the subject. So it's going to, like, if you've ever been in like a crowded cafeteria room, if you think back to like high school or middle school, and like everyone's yelling and you're trying to listen to the person right in front of you, you can kind of tune everyone else out and not pay as much attention to them, and you're only focusing on like the noise, like the one conversation you're dealing with, and your thalamus is important for that. So thalamus, think sensory sorting area. Thalamus is the sensory sorting area. So as I said, this is the thalamus. It's really deep in the middle of the brain here. And as you can see, our mid-sagittal section of the brain doesn't really do it justice. You can't really see very much. It's the interthalamic adhesion. But here we can see that this is the interthalamic adhesion, and that's kind of like the side that we can see. But most of this is going to be just lateral to the mid-sagittal section, so we can't see it as well. So this thalamus is actually really large. It's got a lot of different areas. I'm not going to ask you to be able to identify all these nuclei, but if you take a later neuroscience type class, you might need to know them more. So next we'll talk about the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is really important. It is, as we said, in front of and below the thalamus. So it's going to be this guy right here. So it is a little bit anterior and inferior to the thalamus, and it has a lot of really important functions. It is going to be connected to the pituitary gland by something called an infundibulum, a stalk of the pituitary that extends from the hypothalamus. So we have the hypothalamus, and it's connected via the stalk to a little pituitary gland. They're a really important part of the endocrine system, as well as the hypothalamus does a lot of other things. So you will need to know all these functions. So I say these, I think there's 7 functions of the hypothalamus. Make sure you know them. They'll be important for this and the final. So the hypothalamus is first in charge. It's like in charge of the autonomic nervous system. That's like a whole big part of your, like a whole section of your nervous system, and the hypothalamus is important in controlling that. This influences heart rate, blood pressure, digestive activities, and respiration. So most of those homeostatic things that are automatic. So your hypothalamus is important for those. It also controls a lot of the endocrine system. So the hypothalamus secretes hormones that go to the pituitary gland, and the pituitary gland then secretes hormones that go to these other glands as part of a hormone cascade. And it's going to be really important in regulating a lot of your body's homeostatic mechanisms. The pituitary gland, the hypothalamus is also important in actually producing 2 hormones, antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. And those we'll talk about a lot in endocrine, reproduction, as well as renal and fluid electrolyte. So you don't need to know what they do yet, but we will learn. As we've talked about, when we talked about our homeostatic control mechanisms, the hypothalamus is important in regulating body temperature. So there's neurons in the preoptic area. So that's a specific little nucleus or area of the hypothalamus. And these are going to detect altered body temperature. And then they're going to signal other hypothalamic nuclei to heat or cool the body. And we'll see a picture in just a second that shows you all the different nuclei in the hypothalamus. Once again, I'm not going to ask you to memorize all the nuclei, but kind of look at them, and we'll talk about them as we go through other parts of the nervous system. Your hypothalamus is also important in food intake, so regulating the hunger signals. So there's another nucleus called the ventromedial nucleus that monitors nutrient levels to see how many carbs and how many lipids and how many proteins do you have, and do you need more, and it's going to regulate how hungry you are. Water intake is going to be regulated here. The anterior nucleus monitors the concentration of dissolved solutes or substances in the blood, or the osmolality of the blood. And this is going to regulate thirst. So if we have a lot of things dissolved in the blood, it means we're more dehydrated and we're going to get more thirsty. Sleep-wake rhythms are also something regulated by the hypothalamus. the suprachiasmatic nucleus. And as I said, you don't have to memorize all these nuclei names. I'm just mentioning them so you get used to kind of hearing them. It directs the pineal gland to secrete melatonin. So the pineal gland is the one that actually secretes the melatonin, but the hypothalamus is going to be in charge of telling the pineal gland when to secrete the melatonin. So it's going to ultimately regulate those circadian rhythms. And then finally, the hypothalamus is part of the limbic system. And the limbic system is going to be kind of the emotional brain, and it helps control emotional responses like pleasure and fear, things like that. So as you can tell, this little part of your brain is really important. It does a lot of important things. And so this is it. So here's the thalamus up here. It sits right kind of in front of and below the thalamus. And then we've got a whole bunch of these important nuclei. So the anterior nuclei, the suprachiasmatic nucleus right under the optic chiasm, which is from the nerves, paraventricular nucleus. We talked about some of those in that last picture. The mammillary bodies right here, this is another one you had to identify in lab, and we'll talk a little bit about in the limbic system. So you don't need to memorize or be able to name all these different nuclei. I just kind of be aware of them. They do exist. All right, so what is the function of the pineal gland? You'll have to locate it in the lab. The function of the pineal gland is to secrete melatonin, which regulates sleep-wake cycles. What are the general functions of the thalamus? A good thing to remember is the thalamus is the sensory sorting area. So it's going to sort out your senses to the different lobes, as well as kind of filter out things that were not as important. And then how does the hypothalamus control our feelings of hunger and thirst? So the hypothalamus is going to detect levels of nutrients in the blood, and it's going to regulate levels of hunger, and it's going to detect the levels of dissolved solutes in the blood to regulate our thirst. And we're going to talk a lot more about that in later chapters in 169. All right, so now we're going to move further down. So we talked about the diencephalon, which is that middle part of the brain, and the diencephalon is then connected to the brainstem. So the brainstem is going to be that next part of the brain, and it connects the cerebrum, the diencephalon, and the cerebellum, which we'll get to soon, to the spinal cord. So it's kind of, we have the spinal cord in the bottom, and then it's connected up to the brainstem, and then the brainstem connects to the rest of the brain. It contains things we call ascending and descending tracts. And this is kind of important. We'll talk about it a lot more in the, whatchamacallit, the spinal cord next. But these tracts are going to be axons that move together in one direction or another. So we have the axons of neurons, usually they're myelinated, and these axons are going to move either up or down. So ascending tracts are going to be tracts that start from the peripheral nervous system and then move up the spinal cord to the brain. And so an ascending tract, right, it's going to be getting information from a receptor, a sensory receptor, and it's going to bring it back up the spinal cord to the brain. So ascending tracts are sensory tracts, whereas descending tracts are going to be taking information from the brain and telling the body to do something. So they start in the brain and they descend down the spinal cord and go to like your skeletal muscle. So they're effectors. And so they are descending tracts. So ascending tracts are going to be sensory or afferent, and descending tracts are going to be motor or efferent tracts. And we'll kind of repeat this in the spinal cord chapter too. And so our brainstem contains a lot of autonomic nuclei. So a nuclei, again, is going to be a group of cell bodies that are going to be performing a common function. And autonomic nervous system is all going to be chapter 15. But these are things, usually reflexes that are related to homeostasis. So our brainstem does a lot of homeostasis reflexes. We also have nuclei of cranial nerves. And the nuclei of cranial nerves, these are where the cell bodies of those cranial nerves start. So cranial nerves, and we'll talk about this in lab this week, are going to be the nerves that start in the brain and then go out to the body. And so the cranial nerves have the nuclei, or the cell bodies of those neurons are going to be in the brain. And then the axons are going to go out as nerves. And so the cell bodies are going to live somewhere in the brainstem. And then we have other reflex centers too. So the three parts to know are the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata, and that is from superior to inferior. So the midbrain is on top, and then we have the pons, then we have the medulla oblongata. Make sure you definitely know that order, and you can identify them in class. So here's a nice picture, and we've got, this is the thalamus on top, and the hypothalamus is kind of in the middle over here. You can see it's connected up here to the infundibulum, and here are the mammillary bodies. And we can see the mammillary bodies kind of coming off the hypothalamus, but sort of sitting on the midbrain over here. And so this blue part is going to be the midbrain. there are a lot of cranial nerves coming off here. So all these little guys right here are going to be cranial nerves, nuclei of cranial nerves. And we're not going to name them yet, but I will talk about them in lab. And so we'll be identifying those in lab. This part right here, it's kind of a greenish color, I guess, is going to be the pons. And it looks like a bulb, a little like projection, a lump on the brainstem. That's the pons. And then finally in here, we have the medulla oblongata. And so the medulla oblongata is the lowest part, and it connects directly to the spinal cord. And it's got these little things called pyramids coming across the anterior surface. And then we have this little area where you can see it looks like the pyramids are kind of connected. And this is where the pyramids cross, the decussation of the pyramid. So we have lots of tracks that are going from the brain down to the body, and they cross here. And that's one of the reasons, right, that the left side of the brain controls the right side of the body, and the right side of the brain controls the left side of the body, because most of these tracks cross midline. And a lot of them are going to cross here at the decussation of the pyramids. So this is the anterior view. And we can look at this as kind of a posterior view, a little bit on the lateral side. So we can see the back of the thalamus here, and then down here is the pineal gland, right? Remember, that's part of the epithalamus. Then we have these two guys in the midbrain this is the tectal plate. It's also called the corpora quadrigemina, or we have the two superior colliculi and two inferior colliculi, and we'll talk a little bit about what they do in a second. And then here's the back of the pons, and you can see that these little guys here are going to connect up to the cerebellum. And down here is going to be the medulla oblongata, which connects down to the spinal cord. So we'll kind of talk about them in order. We're going to start with the midbrain. The midbrain has a couple of things that we'll need to identify. So within the midbrain, on the inside of it, I don't know if there's a good picture, the cerebral aqueduct goes through the midbrain. And this is going to be that part of the ventricles. It connects the third ventricle to the fourth ventricle. And it's surrounded by something called periaqueductal gray matter, right? Peri is around, and aqueduct, it's around the aqueduct. The other thing that the midbrain houses is the nuclei, or the cell body of cranial nerve 3, which is the oculomotor nerve, and we'll mention this again in lab, and cranial nerve 4, which is the trochlear nerve. And these are always, we use Roman numerals to number these. So the tectum contains 4 mounds that are making the tectal plate. So that's this guy back here. And we have the superior and inferior colliculi. The superior colliculi are going to control visual reflexes and tracking. So if you see something like run across the, your field of vision and you follow it with your eyes, whereas the inferior colliculi control auditory reflexes. Like if you hear something and, are going to track towards that. So you've got visual and auditory reflexes there. And we can see this is just kind of a cross-section through the midbrain. We have the cerebral aqueduct in the middle, and then we have some gray matter around it. This is through the, slightly higher, it's through the superior colliculus, and you can see here, this is the midbrain over here. And there are a lot of other things in here, and your midbrain does a lot, and we are not going to have time to talk about all the in-depth things that all the different parts of the brain does, unfortunately. So we're just going to focus a little bit on the basics. So you guys are not going to have to be able to identify most of the stuff in this picture, but I just wanted to show you kind of where we're looking at. So the next we'll go down to is the pons. So the pons is the next region. It's below the midbrain. Once again, it includes those sensory or ascending tracts, as well as those motor or descending tracts that connect the brain to the spinal cord. It also connects to the cerebellum through these cerebellar peduncles. And it has a couple of important areas. So this one right here, the pontine respiratory center, is the one that you probably really need to know. We'll talk about this again in our respiration chapter, the respiratory system. The pontine respiratory center is going to help regulate the skeletal muscles of breathing. So remember that the pons is important in helping breathing. And once we get to that chapter, we'll talk about the pontine respiratory center again. So I like to talk about it here to introduce it to you guys. The superior olivary nuclei helps with sound localization. So figuring out where the sound is coming from. And then once again, there are some cranial nerve nuclei, both sensory and motor. So that means they're the cell bodies of these cranial nerves. So we said that the cranial nerves 3 and 4 started in the midbrain. Now we have these cranial nerves 5 to 8. So 5, the trigeminal, 6, abducens, 7, facial, and 8, vestibulocochlear. So cranial nerves 5, 6, 7, and 8 are going to then start, they're going to come off of the pons. So we're kind of, as you can see, the numbers are kind of going in order. 1 and 2 are going to come off of kind of the brain itself. 3 and 4 are going to come off of the midbrain. Then we have 5, 6, 7, and 8 coming off of the pons. And then obviously the rest of them are going to come off of the medulla oblongata. And this will kind of help us as we're trying to figure out which nerve is which in lab. We can correlate it with where they're supposed to be coming from. So here's the pons right here. The pons right here. It's this bulging area on the front of the brainstem, and this is the pontine respiratory center. And that's going to be dealing with respiration. And then we said the superior olivary nucleus has to do with sound localization. The fourth ventricle is going to be kind of located within the pons also. And we can see some of those cell bodies of our cranial nerves. Now, finally, we have the medulla oblongata. The medulla oblongata does a lot. It does a lot of homeostatic reflexes and autonomic reflexes. It's the most inferior part of the brainstem. It connects directly with the spinal cord. And once again, it includes those ascending sensory or afferent tracts and those descending motor or efferent tracts that connect the brain and the spinal cord. An important thing to notice and locate on the medulla are the pyramids. Remember, we said those are the pair of ridges on the anterior surface. So I'm going to go back and show you these are the pyramids. And so these pyramids are going to have a bunch of tracks in them, and they're going to cross right here at the decussation of the pyramids. And so we will briefly mention the names of the different tracks. These are going to be the corticospinal tracts for motor control. And so a lot of our motor tracts are going to go through there. And most of them are going to cross at the decussation of the pyramids. So once again, so each side of the cortex controls movement on the opposite side of the body. And that is just something to remember. Now, we also have a lot of cranial nerve nuclei. Remember, we said we had, we stopped at 8. So we're going to start now at 9. Or I guess part of 8 here is coming from there. Then 9 is glossopharyngeal, 10 is vagus, 11 is accessory, and 12 is hypoglossal nerves. And so we're going to have some of these nuclei here coming off of the medulla. The other thing the medulla does is it has a lot of important autonomic nuclei. And so these are reflex centers that are going to take care of our homeostasis for our different body systems. So the 3 ones that you really need to remember that we'll talk about a lot in other chapters are the cardiac center, which regulates the heart's output in the medulla, the vasomotor center, which regulates the diameter of the blood vessels, and that's going to have a direct effect on blood pressure or a strong influence on blood pressure. As we constrict the blood vessels, it's going to increase the blood pressure. And then the medullary respiratory center, it's going to work with the pontine respiratory center, and it's going to help control the breathing rate. It has the dorsal and ventral respiratory groups, and you guys don't need to know too much about exactly how they work, but we'll talk more about them in the respiratory chapter in 169. There are a bunch of other nuclei for things like coughing and sneezing and salivating and swallowing, and we'll talk a little bit about these things, salivating and swallowing, in the digestive system, but they're going to be important for like these autonomic reflexes. So your medulla does a bunch of those automatic things. So here's the medulla. Here's the pyramids coming down, and this is where a lot of, or most of those motor tracts are going to cross in that decussation of the pyramids. We can see we have a bunch of cranial nerve nuclei. We've got the vagus nerve over here, hypoglossal. And then we also have some fourth ventricle coming down here. And then eventually the fourth ventricle will continue as the central canal of the spinal cord. And we can also see here, this is the lateral view. You have the medullary respiratory center over here, has the dorsal and ventral groups. And then we've got the cardiovascular center over here. Those are the main ones to know. We didn't talk about the substantia nigra, but it's going to be important in creating dopamine and Parkinson's disease. But you guys don't need to know that. Which parts of the midbrain contain paired visual and auditory sensory nuclei? So that was the tactile plate. So the inferior and superior colliculi are going to control some of these reflexes. The general function of the pontine respiratory center in the pons, that's going to be controlling the skeletal muscles associated with breathing. The pyramids are located on the anterior surface of the medulla oblongata, and they're going to contain those corticospinal tracts, and they do cross at the decussation of the pyramids. And they are going to connect the brain to the skeletal muscles on the opposite side of the body. And then we have those main autonomic centers in the medulla are going to be the cardiac center, the respiratory center, and the vasomotor center. So the cardiac center has to do with heart rate. The vasomotor center is going to be blood vessel diameter and blood pressure, and the respiratory center has to do with heart respiration rate, breathing rate. So now we're going to talk about the cerebellum, and the cerebellum is going to be the little brain. So that's kind of what cerebellum means, and it is going to be. It looks a lot like the cerebrum, but it's kind of like you have the brain up here and then you have the little brain attached to the back. It's similar in that it has an outer layer of gray matter, and that's going to be called the cerebellar cortex. And the folds on that are called folia instead of the gyri and the sulci. So it's a little bit different. It also has left and right cerebellar hemispheres, so it kind of mirrors the cerebrum. And you guys don't really need to know too much about the anatomy here. You will need to know that the cerebellar cortex is the outer gray matter and that the inner white matter is called the arbor vitae. Those are the two things that you'll need to be able to identify in lab. There are also some deep gray matters, cerebellar nuclei, just like we had cerebral nuclei in the cerebrum, but we're not going to talk too much about those. We do have some nerve tracts that connect the cerebellum to the brainstem. So the superior cerebellar peduncles connect the cerebellum to the midbrain. The middle cerebellar peduncles connected to the pons, and the inferior cerebellar peduncles connected to the medulla. And so you can kind of see here that this is going to be the white matter on the inside. It looks a little bit like a tree. So the arbor vitae is like the tree of life. So it looks a little bit like a tree. And then the gray matter on the outside is almost like the leaves. That's going to be the cerebral cortex of the gray matter. So the cerebellum is really important for kind of fine-tuning our movements and coordinating movement. It also has to do a little bit with balance, making them more graceful and coordinated. It's going to kind of ensure that our muscular activity follows the right pattern. And it also is important in storing memories of previously learned movements. It maintains equilibrium and posture. So proprioception is information about where our joints are in space. So if you do an experiment and close your eyes and like move your arms around, even if you can't see them, you kind of know where they are. And that's going to be because we have these proprioceptors, these little sensory signals in our joints that are going to be telling us, well, if this joint is flexed or extended, and kind of so if we know if the joints are flexed or extended, our brain can figure out where they are in space. So our brain is continuously going to be sending the motor plans for the body to the cerebellum. And the cerebellum is going to be like, okay, this is the plan. Did the body carry it out correctly? And then, so it's going to compare what the plans looked like to what the body did. And it's going to say, well, this didn't really work out that well. We need to fix this. So it'll send information back to the cerebral cortex to tell it how to fix it. And so we can see here, so we have the motor areas in the frontal lobe are going to send information down. They're going to send, tell our body to walk. And they're also going to say, hey, this is the blueprint I sent to the body. Cerebellum, look at it. So the body's going to start walking, and it's going to send its proprioceptive information back to the cerebellum. And the cerebellum is then going to look at the proprioceptive information. It's going to look at the blueprint, and it's going to kind of decide, did the body do what the brain wanted it to do? Did it work out well? Was it smooth and coordinated? And then it's going to send feedback back to the brain and say, yeah, it was great. Or it's going to say, it's going to say, actually, it wasn't that smooth. We should try to change this or change that. And so that's the kind of corrective feedback. And then it's going to, can correct what's happening, and we can change it as we go down. This is kind of a rough estimation of what the cerebellum does. One of the ways that we can kind of see how the cerebellum is going to, how it works is we can look at patients in which the cerebellum has been impaired. So one of these is that we know that a variety of drugs and alcohol affect the cerebellum. And so alcohol especially is going to affect cerebellar function. So it can impair the cerebellar function. So if you think of someone who's drunk, very drunk, right? They have trouble walking. They're not very coordinated. They are not very balanced. they fall over. They don't really know where their hands are in space. Like if you've ever seen those like cop shows where you see someone that like draw a line and they say, okay, walk in a straight line, or close your eyes and touch your nose, things like that. Because if you don't have the correct proprioceptive information, you might not be able to close your eyes and touch your nose. And so we can think of someone who's really drunk. The other thing is that they have these little, so some cats are infected before they're born in utero. Oh, hold on. Stop. With a virus, and this virus is going to cause their cerebellum to be underdeveloped. So the cerebellum is not as developed as it could be. And so it's called cerebellar hypoplasia. So feline cerebellar hypoplasia. And so these kittens are born with an underdeveloped cerebellum. So we can see what happens to them when the cerebellum's not working, and then we can kind of infer, well, okay, the cerebellum, if they can't walk very straight and, they kind of look drunk, the cerebellum would obviously be helping them coordinate their movement. Usually cats are thought of as pretty graceful. So let's watch this kitten and see what he looks like. His cerebellum is not working as well as it should be. You can see he's a little bit shaky. Oh. And obviously not as coordinated as a normal cat. Turn my volume down a little bit. Oh, poor guy. Okay, so he's gotten older and he's still doing well. Like he can compensate it for it, but you can still say he's a little bit, it's not quite as graceful as the other cats. He's still a little bit shaky, but he has done pretty well as he's gotten older. He's been able to compensate for it. So we can kind of see though how the cerebellum is involved. All right, let's go back to here. So that is my cat video for today. At least it's on topic. So the cerebellum is important in, gait, posture, smoothing out movements, planning, helping plan and coordinate movements, and working with all of the motor areas in the frontal cortex. All right, so the cerebellum, right, we've got the outer gray matter, which is the cerebellar cortex, the inner white matter, which is the arbor vitae. The middle cerebellar peduncles connect the cerebellum to the pons, the middle part of the brainstem, and then we just talked about some of the functions of the cerebellum. All right, now we've talked about kind of all the different pieces of the brain, but there are some areas of the brain that encompass multiple pieces. These are functional brain systems, and so usually they're going to be, they're not just in one area, so it's not just part of the cerebrum or part of the brainstem. It's going to be kind of encompassing multiple different areas. So the first one is the limbic system, or the emotional brain. And this is going to be encompassing parts of the cerebrum as well as parts of the diencephalon. And this all has to do with processing and experiencing the emotions. So if I say the emotional brain, I'm talking about the limbic system. Your book goes into a little bit more depth, but I'm just going to focus on mostly the pieces that you guys need to identify in lab, and the pieces that are important for some of our higher order mental functions. So the hippocampus is one of them. This helps form long-term memories. We can look here. So we've got the hippocampus is going to be this guy over here. And at the bottom of the hippocampus, we have the amygdaloid body. And that's, remember, was one of those cerebral nuclei I said we were going to talk about again. And so the amygdaloid body is involved in many aspects of emotion and emotional memory, especially fear. And so both of these have to do with memory, and we're going to talk a little bit about memory, and your discussion board, it talks a little bit about memory too. And the hippocampus and the amygdala, or the amygdaloid body, are two important areas for memory consolidation. So the olfactory bulbs, olfactory tracts, and olfactory cortex. This is smell. So olfactory is cranial nerve 1, and we'll talk about that in lab. And so cranial nerve 1 is going to include these bulbs, olfactory bulbs, tracts, and then the olfactory cortex is going to be in the temporal lobe. And these are going to process odors, and a lot of those odors can provoke emotion. As I said, these odors can be directly tied to emotional responses, or like fear, danger, reflexes. The fornix is going to be a white matter tract that connects the hippocampus with other limbic structures. And these are all things that you'll have to, well, these two at least are things you'll have to identify in lab. And these, hippocampus and amygdala, you guys will be able to know that they're important in long-term memory. So these are kind of 4 of the main important structures of the limbic system, but it does include some other structures too. So it's going to be everything that's kind of purple over here. And it's going to include, so the cingulate gyrus is going to be this gyrus right here. It's one of the deeper gyruses in the cerebrum, and it's going to be included. It's right on top of the corpus callosum and right near the diencephalon. The fornix is this little guy over here that's going to connect the hippocampus up to these other structures. The mammillary bodies, remember, that are coming off the hypothalamus over here, are going to be part of the limbic system. And then some of the thalamic nuclei are going to be part of the limbic system. So you've got all of these different parts that kind of work together. So this part right here is the olfactory bulb, olfactory tract, and then we've got the olfactory cortex is going to be in that temporal lobe. So all of these are going to work together for emotions, as well as memories, and then odors are pretty important in that too. So the next functional brain region that we'll talk about is the reticular system, or the reticular formation. And this is going to be loosely organized gray matter that's deep in the brainstem. And so if we look here, you can see that it starts up here at the bottom of the diencephalon and kind of goes down. It's this orange stuff. This is all the reticular formation. And it's going to go through all different parts of the brainstem, and part of the diencephalon, which is why we're going to talk about it here as just this functional brain region. It has a couple of different parts. There's a motor component. It's going to regulate muscle tone, and it assists in some of these autonomic functions. But we'll kind of mainly talk about the sensory component of it. And the sensory component of it is called the reticular activating system, or the RAS. It's the reticular activating system. And this is kind of like linked to your how aware and conscious and focused you are. And so it processes sensory information, and it's going to send signals to the cortex to bring about alertness. So think about you're sleeping, and then when the alarm clock comes on, it wakes you up, right? So that's part of that, is the reticular activating system kind of waking you up. And this is going to bring about awareness, awareness of sensations, of movements, awareness of what's happening in lecture, who's around you. And so all of these things are really important for higher levels of consciousness and higher thought processes. So in order for you to be more awake and more focused, that reticular activating system is important for that. So that's the sensory part of this reticular formation. All right. Now, I want to talk a little bit about a couple of higher order processes. So we talked about speech, sleep, or I guess language, sleep, and a little bit about consciousness and the development of some of these higher order functions last time, because they were pretty much only in the cerebral cortex. But now some of these, like memory especially, is going to be very tied to the limbic system. And so I'm going to talk about it now. And your discussion board talks a little bit about memory and how it's created, and some things like that. So there are a couple of different types of memory. And these 3 different types of memory. First one is sensory memory. And this is just very quick. This is your awareness of that sense. And then any associations you have based on that sensory input. So you come into the cafe and you smell the cafe and you think about something. And this just lasts for seconds. It's a very brief memory. If you're paying attention to some of this and you are focused on it, we can move things into short-term memory. Short-term memory are going to be, they have a limited capacity, about 7 bits of information. And we can remember this because most of our phone numbers, if you don't include the area code, have 7 numbers, right? So the first 3, right? And then the last 4, 7 total. So 7 bits of information. And they have a brief duration, seconds to hours. So you can think about it if you've ever been listening to the radio and they're if you know the answer to this question, you can win something, call, and they rattle off the number, and you're trying to keep it in your mind until you get to the stoplight, and then you have to try to type it in to your phone. That's, you're trying to keep something in short-term memory, but it's a pretty brief duration, and you might forget. You forget pretty quick. But in order to get it into long-term memory, we have to do something called encoding. And so we encode something from short-term memory into long-term memory. Usually this will only happen if the information is repeated, right? And so that's why as you're driving along, you're trying to repeat the phone number in your head over and over and over again to try to get it to go into long-term memory. Once it gets there, there are some different theories. We think it might exist indefinitely, but it can be lost if not retrieved occasionally. There's different theories of how long it's stored and how exactly it's stored. But so this is kind of a good graphic to know. So we have the stimulus first. We're going to see or hear or feel something. It's going to go to the sensory organs and we'll perceive it. And that perception itself is kind of like a memory, or like we are perceiving it. This is going to happen very quickly. That we go inside and we smell something. We're aware and conscious of that sense. If we pay attention to that, then it might go into short-term memory. We might be able to, we'll think about it for a little while. We're paying attention to it. We're aware of it for a little while. If we don't pay attention to it, we'll probably forget. There's a lot of things that we see or hear that we like. They just, one in one ear and out the other, right? It doesn't even go to short-term memory. If we pay attention to it and we're focused on it, it might go to short-term memory. This is going to be, maybe a couple minutes. And if we don't repeat it, we're going to forget it. And so that's like what we're listening to right now during lecture. It might go in one ear and out the other. And if we don't repeat it, we're probably going to forget it, even if we've kind of paid attention to it for a little bit. So we have to repeat it a lot. And so if we repeat it a lot, we can eventually encode it into long-term memory. And long-term memory can last for a really long time, but we do have to eventually keep retrieving it. So you want to eventually kind of pull it back out and look at it and think about it in order to make those neurons stronger and that association stronger. And there's like a continuum of forgetting. And if you're doing flashcards, it kind of helps if you space out your learning. It's called spaced retrieval practice. So like, let's say you're doing the flashcards and one day you know them all and it's great. And you try them the next day and you know them all, it's great. So that's good, but it doesn't mean it's going to be kind of in long-term memory forever. So then let's say you put them down for like 3 days and then you try it again. And at that point, if you were like really close to forgetting, and the closer you are to forgetting and the more effort it takes to retrieve that information, like the harder it is to remember it, the more lasting impact, the more likely it'll be encoded into long-term memory and you'll be able to get it again. So it's good to like space that studying so that you kind of almost forgotten the material and then you can retrieve it again. And so that's encoding for long-term memory. Now there are some areas in the brain that are really important for this. And we said that the amygdala and the hippocampus are both required for encoding that into long-term memory. And so we need to have a functioning amygdala and hippocampus in order to encode more new long-term memories. Long-term memories are then usually housed in the appropriate association cortex area. And so remember, the association areas are going to be areas that they're not directly receiving the sense, but they're in that lobe next to that sense. And so if it's a motor memory, it might be stored in the premotor cortex or the cerebellum, because the cerebellum has a lot to do with motor stuff. If it's a memory of sound, it might be stored in the auditory association area. If it's a memory of some sort of vision, it might be stored in the occipital association area, and so on. Emotion is another thing that's going to involve a lot of different brain sections. And there are my children. You can hear them screaming in the background. So what did we say was the emotional brain again? The limbic system, right? So the limbic system is going to be really important in interpreting emotions. And so the limbic system is important in interpreting emotions, but the expression of emotions. So if you decide to have a temper tantrum like my child over there, or to like calm down and just hold it in until later, the expression of the emotion is controlled by the prefrontal cortex, which, as we talked about before, is under development in young children, right? And because that prefrontal cortex is under development in young children, and they're not very good at controlling the expression of emotion. So if they're mad, they are mad and they express it. That was that temper tantrum. If they're happy, you can see they're really happy. So because that prefrontal cortex is under development in young children, especially, and even in teenagers as you go, they might not be able to control that expression of emotion as well as adults can. Once again, the amygdala and the hippocampus are also important structures involved in both memory and emotion. And so if we damage those structures or we stimulate them artificially, emotions can either be deadened or exaggerated, as well as learning is impaired, right? Because memory and learning are very, and emotion and learning. And also, like, emotions are connected to memory. So anything that you have a really strong emotional connection with is going to be easier to remember than something that you don't, something you think is boring. So if it's something you're really passionate about and you think it's really cool, it might be easier to remember than something that you're like, I really could take it or leave it. I'm not as interested. All right, so that is going to be the last